Julian Lennon's childhood was quietly written into some of the most famous songs ever made. A drawing turned into a global hit. A melody meant to comfort him became an anthem. Then came a brief reconnection in the mid-1970s, followed by a sudden, violent ending on December 8, 1980. What came after stretched across years of legal battles, emotional distance, and unanswered questions. His life was never ordinary. It was shaped by fame, absence, and moments that didn't quite fit together. And for years, many believed one thing, that he blamed Yoko Ono for everything. But is that really the full story? Or just the version people wanted to believe? It all begins in Liverpool, April 8, 1963. Julian is born just as the Beatles are starting to rise. At that moment, his father isn't yet the global icon the world will soon worship. But within months, everything explodes. By 1964, Beatlemania takes over, and millions are watching. Yet behind that noise, something very different is happening at home. John Lennon's marriage to Cynthia is kept almost completely hidden. Fans don't know. The world doesn't see it. And that means Julian grows up in a strange kind of silence. But what does it do to a child? When the whole world knows your father, but barely knows you exist. Cynthia later described living in near isolation. Moving from place to place. Rarely appearing in public. It was like she had been erased from the story. Meanwhile, John is constantly away, touring, recording, living a life that belongs more to stadiums than to family. For Julian, early memories aren't built around a present father. They're built around distance. Photos, records, a voice that feels far away. And then, just as things are already fragile, something else enters the picture. In 1966, John meets Yoko Ono at an art exhibition in London. At first, it seems small. Just another moment in a busy life. But by 1967, their connection deepens. John begins to change. More distant. More absorbed in a different world. Cynthia notices it. The shift is real. And for a young child like Julian, even if he doesn't understand it fully, he feels it. So when the breaking point finally comes in 1968, it doesn't come out of nowhere. But what happens next still changes everything. Cynthia returns home one day and finds Yoko there. Within months, the marriage is over. The divorce is finalized later that year. Julian is just 5. The legal side is settled. Money, custody, arrangements. But none of that fixes what really matters. From that moment on, Julian grows up with his mother, far from the center of his father's world. Meanwhile, John's life moves in a completely different direction. A new relationship. A new family. A new son, Sean, born in 1975. And suddenly, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. One child close. The other, not so much. But here's where things get even more complicated. Julian isn't entirely outside his father's world. In fact, parts of his childhood are frozen inside music history. One day in 1967, he brings home a simple drawing from school. A girl floating among stars. He calls it Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. That phrase becomes the title of a song heard by millions. Think about that for a second. A child's imagination turned into a global phenomenon. But does that kind of connection mean anything? If the relationship itself is missing? Then comes another moment. 1968. Paul McCartney drives out to visit Julian after the divorce. On that drive, he starts writing a song to comfort him. It's first called Hey Jules. Later, it becomes Hey Jude. One of the biggest songs ever. The words are meant for a child going through heartbreak. Take a sad song and make it better. But here's the question. Did it actually make anything better? Because in real life, things don't resolve like songs do. Julian continues to grow up mostly without his father. Visits are rare. Contact is inconsistent. Meanwhile, John is speaking to the world about love and peace. And that contrast doesn't go unnoticed. Years later, Julian would talk about it openly, the gap between what his father said publicly and what he lived privately. So how do you make sense of that as a son? There were moments when things improved. Between 1973 and 1975, during a period known as John's Lost Weekend, the two spent time together. Trips, conversations, even music. For a while, it felt normal, real. John even bought him instruments. But just as quickly as it came, it faded again. By 1975, John returns to New York, reunites with Yoko, and focuses on raising his second son. And that's when the reality becomes clear. The father Julian wanted, existed, just not for him. So what does that do to a relationship over time? By 1980, there are signs things might change. John releases new music. There are hints of reconnect ion. Maybe even a chance to rebuild. But then, on December 8th, everything stops. John Lennon is shot and killed outside his home in New York. Just like that, any chance of fixing the past disappears. And what's left behind is complicated. In the aftermath, attention turns to his estate. A fortune worth hundreds of millions. But the will, written years earlier, leaves most of it to Yoko Ono and their son Sean. Julian is not included in the same way. And suddenly, another chapter begins, one filled with legal battles, negotiations, and years of tension. Eventually, a settlement is reached. The exact details remain private. But the emotional impact? That's harder to measure. Because this was never just about money, was it? Julian builds his own career. In 1984, he releases his debut album Veloute. It's successful, critically praised. But there's a catch. Everywhere he goes, he's compared to his father. His voice, his style, his presence. It follows him constantly. So even as he tries to create his own identity, he's always tied to someone else's legacy. And that brings us back to the question people keep asking. Did Julian Lennon hate Yoko Ono? The answer isn't that simple. Over the years, he's spoken about feeling left out, about things being unfair, about complicated family dynamics. Yoko was part of that story, yes, but she wasn't the whole story. As time passed, his perspective began to shift. The anger didn't disappear overnight. He described it as something that stayed with him for years, a constant cloud. But slowly, things changed. Forgiveness didn't come as a single moment. It came gradually, piece by piece. He explored new paths, photography, humanitarian work, environmental causes. He built a life that wasn't defined only by the past. And in doing so, he began to see things differently. Not just as a son, but as someone trying to understand a complicated human story. So when people reduce it all to one simple idea, that he despised Yoko Ono, they miss the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one person. It was about absence, timing, choices, and the weight of growing up in the shadow of one of the most famous men in history. And maybe the real question isn't who was to blame, but how someone finds peace after living through all of that.